In this video here, I'd like to introduce you to some of the basics of Excel. This is by no means an exhaustive list, it's just something to get you started. First, you will note that an Excel file is called a workbook. And within a workbook, we will have various worksheets. And if you want to add another worksheet, you can simply hit the plus button down here to add another sheet. Next, within the Excel worksheet, you'll know that it is organized into columns which have letters associated with it, and then rows which have numbers associated with it. And then wherever you're at is called a cell. And you'll notice the cell is going to be identified up here in the upper left-hand corner by both its column as well as its row designator. In this case, it's A1. Now, if you want to input any data into a cell, you can simply highlight that cell and type directly into it. Notice that it's showing both here in the Excel as well as in the function bar up here at the top. And I can also choose to go into the function bar up at the top and type the same thing, and it's going to show up. Now, there's lots of different inputs that you can put into a cell. You'll note here I just put text. I can also put the date. I can also put a number. I can also put an equation using the equal sign as simple types of input. Now, another thing to keep in mind is, let's say that you actually wanted to put 2/4. Notice that this automatically changes it to a date. If you actually want it to read 2/4, we put 1 apostrophe and then we can put 2-4. And basically, it's going to tell Excel that anything following that you want entered into the cell verbatim. Next, let's go over some simple mathematical manipulations. Oftentimes, we are going to have data that we are going to want to perform mathematical operations on. So let's go over here to column C, and let's just call this data 1, because it's always helpful to label your data. And let's just put a bunch of random numbers in there. Now let's do the same thing in column D, and let's have a second set of data we'll call data 2. And again, we'll just randomly populate this with whatever comes to mind. Now let's say that we want to perform mathematical operations. Let's say that we want to add data 1 plus data 2. That's simply going to be the equal sign, and then you'll hit your target cell, you'll hit the plus button, and then your next target cell. And that will give you data 1 plus data 2. Now, we could repeat that going all the way down, row by row by row, but what Excel does is it allows you to automate this process fairly quickly. So if we highlight the cell, we can come down to the lower right-hand corner where we see there's a little filled box. And you'll notice that my large cross turns into a crosshair if I go over that little box. I can then drag down and I can populate all of my cells. Next, let's say we want to subtract. So we're going to subtract data 1 minus data 2. In this case here, I will simply say, again, equal sign, data 1 minus data 2. And I can hit enter. Now we can do the same process I did before, where I came up here and I grabbed this and I dragged it down. Or a quicker automation would be to come up to the box in the lower right-hand corner. When my plus turns into a crosshair, if I double-click it, it'll take it and it'll populate all the cells down below. Now let's say I'm going to call something data 3, and in data 3 I'm going to multiply data 1 times data 2. So here I'm going to say that this is going to be equal to data 1, and now I'm going to use the asterisk sign as my multiplication sign for data 2. Hit enter and populate it all the way down. Now, one thing that's an important tip is that when I start my data, again, I've labeled all of my columns so I know what my data is. For column E and column F, it's fairly self-explanatory what these are because I put them in the title up above. Data 3, just by looking at it, I'm not exactly sure what it is. Now, of course, I can come down here and I can kind of maybe figure out what it is. But what would be nice is if I come up here and if I click on Review and I click on New Comment, I can say data 3 equals data 1 times data 2 and hit Enter. Then you'll notice there's a little red triangle in the upper right-hand corner. If I come up to that little triangle right there, it'll tell me exactly what I've inputted here for data 3, what that's supposed to mean. And that's a nice little trick so that you keep track of what all your variables are. So let's go ahead and do that again for data 4. And we're going to say data 4 is going to equal to data 1 divided by data 2. Same thing, I'll hit Enter. Same thing, I'll populate my data. I will come up here, I will click on my new comment, and I will say data 4 equals data 1 divided by data 2. Something else we might want to do is we might want to raise something to a higher power. So let's say I want to take data 1 and I want to square it. So I can take data 1 and my little caret sign here is going to raise it to a higher power. And if I'm going to square it, I'm going to raise it to a higher power of 2. So now I can click on my equal sign, because you always have to have an equal sign when you're entering values like so. And I can take my data 1 and I say that I'm going to square it. And again, I can drag it all the way down. Now, a nice thing about Excel as well is I can click on any cell, and if I double click it, it's going to highlight what cells are being referenced. So I can see here, this is referencing cell C6, and I'm going to square that cell. Finally, I can also take the square root. Let's do square root of data 2. And as you might have implied here, I'm going to take the square root, forgot my equal sign, equals the square root of data 2. Close my parentheses, and then again I can either double click or I can drag all the way down in order to fill it. With Excel, I can also perform trig functions. Let's say that I'm given degrees and I want to find the cosine and the sine of those degrees. So again, I'm going to hit my equal sign, and I'm going to type cosine, and I'm going to open my parentheses, click on my number, and I'm going to hit Enter. And I can go ahead and I can drag that all the way down. Now, oops, wait a minute, what happened? If you're familiar with your sines and cosines, you'll know that the cosine of 0 is indeed 1, but the cosine of 30 degrees is not 0.15, and the cosine of 90 degrees should be 0, not a negative 0.44807. So what happened? What happened here is that Excel only recognizes trig functions for radians. So what we have to do is we have to convert our degrees to radians before we determine the sines and cosines. Now, there's two ways in which we can do that. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to insert a column here, and I can make a new column which says radians, and I can say this is going to be equal to radians, and I'm going to click on my reference cell with my degrees, close my parentheses, and then drag that all the way down. Now over here, I can take my cosine, and now instead of having it be equal to the degrees, I'm going to have the cosine function or target the radian cell. And now when I do that, my values should align more so with what I would expect them to look like. Where I have the cosine of 0 is 1, the cosine of 30 is 0.866, the cosine of 45 is 0.707, the cosine of 60 is 0.5, and the cosine of 90 should be 0. Now what is this funky number right here? This funky number right here is actually scientific notation. This is actually 6.13 times 10 to the negative 17. That means we have to put 17 zeros in front of this 6. If this is freaking you out and you don't like this, we can simply right-click on it. We can go to Format Cells, and we can change that from general to a number, and we can leave our decimal places here as being 2 and hit OK, and that's going to change it to zeros. So that's one way in which we can determine our trig functions, is that first we take our degrees, we convert them to radians, and then we would take our trig function. Next, we can embed our conversion from degrees to radians in our function itself. So here we're actually going to nest the two, so we're going to say that this is going to be equal to the sine of the radians of our degrees. And then we have to close our first parentheses, and then we have to close our second parentheses. We hit enter, and then we drag our values down, and we will see that our values here for sine should align with what we know them to be for 0, 30, 45, 60, and 90 degrees, being 0, 5, 0.707, 0.866, and 1, respectively. We can also use our trig functions in order to find an angle if we're given coordinates. In this case, I have 4 different scenarios. Each scenario starts in a coordinate of 0, 0. Scenario 1 is going to have a final x and y value of positive 2. Scenario 2 is going to have an x value of negative 2 and a y value of positive 2. Scenario 3 is going to have an x and y value of negative 2. And scenario 4 is going to have an x value of positive 2 and a y value of negative 2. So now we want to find the angle that corresponds to each of these. So we are going to end up using the atan function. So again, we have to have equal because we're talking a function, and we're going to say this is going to be equal to atan. And now we have to recall that our atan is going to be our change in y divided by our change in x. So I'm going to actually nest this and say our change in y divided by our change in x. Close my parentheses and hit enter. Now you may be scratching your head looking at this, saying this does not look right. We know that I should have an angle of about 45 degrees. So what I'm going to do here is, again, I have to realize that Excel is going to put everything in radians. So now I have to change these to degrees. And so I'm simply going to say that this is going to equal degrees of this. And you will see that indeed I get 45 degrees. Now, what I can do is I can repeat this process over and over and over again. But again, one of the great things about Excel is it allows you to automate the process. So rather than retyping all of these formulas, I'm going to just copy and I'm going to paste for my second scenario. And then I'm going to paste for my third scenario. And I'm going to paste for my fourth scenario. So rather than having to retype things over and over and over again, the process is automated. Now, if you note here, we see that for scenarios 1 and scenarios 3, I have 45 degrees. And then for scenarios 2 and for scenarios 4, I have a negative 45 degrees. But in reality, only scenario 1 is 45 degrees. Scenario 2 is actually going to be 135 degrees. Scenario 3 is going to be 225 degrees. And scenario 4 will indeed be negative 45 degrees. The reason why this is because Excel only does the formula itself. So if we have a 2 divided by a 2, we're going to have a 1. If we have a negative 2 divided by a negative 2, we're still going to have a 1. So our same values are going to come up being here. This can be problematic if we want to ensure we know which quadrant we're going to be in. So I would highly recommend, rather than using the atan function, we use a function that's called atan2. atan2 is going to take 2 arguments in order to determine what the actual degrees are supposed to be. So here we're going to say this is going to be equal to a tan 2, and we're going to open our parentheses, and I want to pause here for a second, and I want you to note that it says x comma y. So remember, when we're taking the a tan function, it's y divided by x. A tan 2 in Excel, it wants x comma y. So we are going to say our x, and then our y. Close parentheses, hit enter, and we have our 45 degrees. And now again, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to move it down, and move it down, and move it down. And you'll note now this is giving us our angle in degrees, all from the right horizontal, which is where we want it. A couple of other kind of neat little tricks to go from Excel. Sometimes we want to autofill a particular column with data. Let's say that we are going to create a simulation and we want time. Well, and let's make sure we're labeling that in terms of seconds. And let's say that we're going to start at 0, and we're going to say 0.01, 0.02, and we could type that all the way down. Now, if we only have 3 or 4 values, we can do that and it's not too tedious. However, if we are going to say go to 1 second this way, it could get a little bit tedious. So what we can do is we can highlight these 3 values right here, go down to my lower box right here, turn my plus sign into a crosshair, and I can drag all the way down until I get to 1. This also can be a little tedious though, depending on how many values you have. And as you can see there, I kind of had to float around in order to get exactly where I want it. So another option that we have available to us is we can go to this cell right here. We can type in 0. I can come back to this cell and come up here to where it says fill. I can click fill, and I'm going to fill a series. I'm going to switch from row to column. I'm going to have a step value. In this case, let's make it really big, or really small, I should say. Let's put 001, and then my stop value here of 1, and hit OK. And now it's going to populate from 0 all the way down through 1,002 rows to get to value of 1. Which is a lot simpler than trying to hand type it in yourself. Something else to keep in mind is, let's say that we wanted to multiply this time by a specific value. And let's just call it value A. Well, we could take our value A and we can say that that's going to be equal to, let's say, 5. And we can double click that all the way down. And then we can say A times T is equal to A times T. Hit our enter and have that go all the way down. But column B here is really starting to clutter up our table, and it's all the same value. Do we really need to do that? Maybe not. What we could do, I'm just going to delete these and get rid of them. I'm going to insert a couple of columns here. And I am going to say value A is equal to 5. And now over here, I can say again A times T. And I'm going to say this is equal to A. And then I am going to hit the F4 function. And you'll notice the F4 function has now put it so that I have a $sign in front of the A and a $sign in front of the 2. This is called pinning. This is going to pin that value, so I'm always going to refer back to this cell, and I'm going to multiply it by C2. I hit enter, and I click all the way down, and it's going to do the same thing. You'll notice that it always points back to cell A2 and it multiplies it by cell A2. Now, let's go back to where I was before, and let's just say that this is going to be a value of A, and it's going to be equal to 5, and we're going to say 5 all the way down. Now let's say I'm going to have a value of B, and B is going to be 7, and that's going to go all the way down. And now let's say I want to do A times T. Again, I can say this is going to be equal to A times T, hit enter, and go all the way down. Now let's say I want to do B times T. Now I could, and this is fairly simple, I could just say it's going to be equal to B and multiply that by T. Or if I have a really long, complicated equation, I might not want to keep typing that equation out. So I'm going to come back over here to my A times T. So I can type in my C2, and then I'm going to hit F4 once, twice, 3 times. What this does is now this is going to pin it to column C, but it's going to let the row go to whatever row I'm pointing at. And this will make more sense here in a second. So I'm going to hit enter, I'm going to double click all the way down, and you see here my numbers haven't changed. But now what I can do is I can take my crosshair and I'm going to go 1 over to the right, and from here I'm now going to go all the way down. And what you'll see I did right here is now I have E3 times column C, row 3. What happened? And what happened with this particular function? Well, if I go back over here to my F column here, what I'm telling Excel is that I want to multiply 2 rows over by 3 rows over, but make sure that I'm always on column C. Now if I come over here, again I said I want to multiply something that's 2 columns over, but then I always want to multiply it by the corresponding row in column C. And again, this is something that you'll get more familiar with as different scenarios come up. I just wanted to bring that up as some handy shortcuts for you to follow when you're doing Excel. I hope this helps.